It was a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary in every way that matters. The kind of day nobody remembers. Fluorescent lights humming over a food court, sneakers squeaking on polished floors, 100 conversations bleeding into one another until the whole building sounds like static. Families with strollers, teenagers with bags, a man arguing on his phone near a pretzel stand. Nothing sacred, nothing significant. Just the beautiful, unglamorous noise of ordinary American life moving at its usual speed. And then a little boy stopped. He couldn't have been older than 5, small enough that the crowd moved around him like water around a stone, oblivious, unstoppable. His mother felt the tug first, that familiar pull on her sleeve that mothers know means something has shifted in their child's universe. She turned, ready for the usual. A toy in a window, a dog on a leash, an escalator that looked like magic, but his arm was extended outward, his finger pointing, not at a window, not at a display, at a man. A tall, dark-haired man, moving calmly through the crowd, like someone who had nowhere urgent to be. A man with the kind of eyes that, even from a distance, seemed to hold something steady in them. Something still. The boy's voice cut through everything. "Mommy, that's Jesus." He didn't whisper it. He didn't ask it. He announced it, with the absolute, unshakable certainty that only a child of 5 can produce. The kind of certainty that has no room for doubt, because doubt hasn't arrived yet. Pure, unfiltered, loud enough that 3 women at a nearby table looked up from their phones. Loud enough that a teenage boy mid-bite paused his chewing. Loud enough that the tall, dark-haired man himself, calm, unhurried, almost serene, stopped walking. He turned. The mother was already mortified, reaching for her son, cheeks flushed, mouth opening, to apologize, to explain, to do that particular parental damage control that means, please everyone go back to your lunches. But the man wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the boy. And whatever was in his eyes in that moment, warmth, recognition, something that had no clean secular name, it stopped her mid-apology. What he did next, nobody expected. And within 48 hours, nobody would be able to stop talking about it. But to understand why this moment hit the world so hard, you first need to understand who Jonathan Roumie really is, and why, for millions of people, that little boy wasn't entirely wrong. Take a step back. Because to understand why a 30-second moment in a shopping mall moved millions of people to tears, you have to understand the world it landed in. 2024 was not a gentle year. It was the kind of year that aged people. The news cycle ran on outrage like an engine runs on fuel. Constant, consuming, leaving a residue of exhaustion on everyone who touched it. In a place where social media had become the loudest voices weren't the wisest ones, where a person's worth was measured in engagement, where genuine human connection felt increasingly like something you remembered from before. Before the algorithms, before the division, before the scroll became a reflex instead of a choice. People were tired, not sleepy tired, soul tired. The kind of fatigue that makes you stop mid-afternoon and realize you can't remember the last time something made you feel genuinely, uncynically good. Into that exhaustion walked the chosen, not with a studio behind it, not with a Hollywood marketing budget or a streaming giant's algorithm pushing it to the top of your queue. The chosen arrived the way the most surprising things always do, quietly, from the margins, funded not by corporations, but by ordinary people who believed in something and put their money behind that belief. It was crowd-funded, built donation by donation, prayer by prayer, by viewers who wanted to see the story of Jesus, told not as spectacle, not as propaganda, but as something intimate and alive. The numbers that followed were staggering. Over 700 million views worldwide, translated into dozens of languages, watched in living rooms and church basements and hospital wards and prison cells across every continent. For a production that the industry never greenlit, that no executive ever championed, that survived entirely on the conviction of its audience. It became, by any honest measure, the most watched Christian media production in the history of the medium. Not a niche success, a global phenomenon. And at the center of it, carrying the full weight of the most portrayed figure in human history, was Jonathan Roumie. Before The Chosen, most people hadn't heard his name. He was a working actor. Decent credits, respectable craft, no marquee. The kind of talent that the industry holds at arm's length for reasons that have nothing to do with ability and everything to do with timing, luck, and the particular cruelty of a business that manufactures stars rather than recognizing them. Then he put on that robe, and everything changed. Because what Roumie did with the role of Jesus was not what audiences expected. He didn't give them the stained glass version, distant, ethereal, draped in golden light and theological abstraction. He gave them a Jesus who laughed at dinner tables, who got frustrated, who wept with such rawness that viewers wept with him without knowing why, who looked at people, really looked, the way almost nobody looks at anybody anymore, and made them feel, through a screen, genuinely seen. For hundreds of millions of people, that performance didn't just entertain. It healed something, and children don't process that through critique or context or comfortable adult distance. They receive it whole. They feel what is true before they can name it. So when a 5-year-old boy looked across a crowded mall and pointed at this man, he wasn't making an error in judgment. He was doing what children do best. Seeing clearly, without the interference of sophistication. He saw what millions of adults already felt, but had never quite found the words to say. But before we get to what Jonathan did in that mall, you need to know what it cost him to become this person. Because the man that little boy pointed to didn't arrive there by accident. Not everyone was moved. That is the part of this story that doesn't make the inspirational highlight reels, but it belongs here. Because you cannot fully appreciate what this moment meant without first understanding the wall of skepticism it had to pass through to reach you. And that wall was built long before a little boy ever pointed across a food court. When The Chosen first began circulating online, the reaction from certain corners of the cultural establishment was exactly what you would expect. The eye rolls came first, the particular brand of dismissal that doesn't bother to engage because engagement would imply the thing is worth taking seriously. Faith-based content in the taxonomy of prestige entertainment had long been filed under a specific category. Well-meaning, poorly made, and strictly for people who don't know any better. The industry had a template for it: low budgets, soft lighting, dialogue that sounded like it was written by a committee afraid of offense, movies that opened at churches and closed everywhere else. The Chosen didn't fit the template. And that made the skeptics more uncomfortable, not less. Think pieces appeared in the kinds of publications that pride themselves on taste. The framing was always careful, always cloaked in the language of concern rather than contempt. But the message was consistent. Wasn't this just evangelical propaganda with higher production values? Wasn't crowdfunding a religious series essentially a church collection plate with a streaming interface? Wasn't the enthusiasm of its audience less a testament to quality and more a testament to the desperation of a community starved for representation? The sophistication of the critique was its own kind of condescension. The assumption that 700 million viewers had simply been too credulous to notice what the critics could see from the outside. Industry insiders were blunter. Faith-based content doesn't cross over, the thinking went. It plays to the base and disappears. You can't build a prestige audience on devotion. Devotion is not a demographic, it is a limitation. Several entertainment journalists covering the streaming wars barely mentioned The Chosen in their annual roundups, even as its numbers climbed past properties that received breathless coverage. The silence was its own statement. Then the mall video arrived, and the skeptics found a new target. Within hours of the clip circulating, a counter-narrative assembled itself with the efficiency that social media has perfected. The comments came in waves. The first wave said it was staged, a publicity stunt for the show, a manufactured moment designed to generate exactly the kind of emotional response it was generating. The second wave shifted to the mother. Why hadn't she corrected her child? What kind of parent allows a 5-year-old to approach a stranger under a religious delusion without intervening? Was this healthy modeling? Was this, someone asked in a thread that collected thousands of likes, a form of parasocial delusion being passed down a generation? The third wave went after the feeling itself. The people who were moved by this video, the argument went, were being manipulated. They were projecting. They were confusing a performer's skill with spiritual substance. Jonathan Roumie was an actor. A good one, apparently. But an actor. And an actor kneeling in a mall was not a miracle. It was a photo opportunity, whether he intended it that way or not. Read these arguments and you will notice something. They are not stupid. They are, in their own sealed logic, coherent. The person who wrote them is not a monster. They are someone who has been trained by culture, by disappointment, by the reasonable observation that the world contains a great deal of performance dressed as sincerity, to protect themselves from being moved by things that might not deserve it. What they could not do was see what the boy saw. And that is the quiet tragedy running underneath all of it. The child had no framework for cynicism. He had no template for managing the risk of being wrong about something beautiful. He looked at a man and felt something his vocabulary couldn't contain, and he said the only word he had for it. The sophisticated adult sees an actor hitting his marks in an off-season mall appearance. The 5-year-old sees something that stops him mid-step and makes him reach for his mother's sleeve. You already know which of them was paying closer attention. But here is the thing about cynicism that its practitioners rarely advertise. It is not a conclusion. It is a defense. And defenses, by their nature, come down. When the evidence is undeniable, when the story is too specific to be manufactured, when the life behind the moment turns out to be something that no publicity team could have scripted. Cynics have a funny habit of going quiet when the facts arrive. And the facts about Jonathan Roumie's life? They silence rooms. Every story has a before. A long, unglamorous, largely unwitnessed before. The years that don't make it into the highlight reel. The seasons of formation that only make sense in retrospect, when you can finally see the shape of what all that waiting was building toward. Jonathan Roumie has a before. And it matters more than most. He was born between two worlds. His father Egyptian, his mother Irish-American. A pairing that, in the geometry of identity, gives a child two complete inheritances and the lifelong, quietly beautiful work of holding them both without losing either. He grew up in New York, which is to say he grew up in a city that contains multitudes and expects you to contain them too. He was formed by that duality, the warmth of the Arab world and the resilience of the Irish one, the ancient faith of the East and the scrappy, street-level Catholicism of the West. Two rivers, one current. He didn't have to choose between them. He learned, instead, to flow. What he chose was acting. And the industry, as it does with most people who choose it honestly, made him wait. For more than a decade, Jonathan Roumie worked. Small roles. Guest appearances. The kind of credits that keep a career technically alive without ever quite igniting it. He was good. People who worked with him said so. But goodness in that industry is a necessary condition, never a sufficient one. The gap between talented and discovered is where most careers quietly end, not with a rejection, but with an attrition, a gradual erosion of momentum, until one day you realize the dream has become a memory you're still pretending is a plan. He didn't quit. That is the first fact about him that matters. He also prayed. Not as a ritual performed at safe distances from real life, but as a practice woven into the actual fabric of his days. He is a devout Catholic. The practicing kind, the inconvenient kind, the kind that actually changes how a person moves through the world. He fasted. He went to Mass. He sat with the faith, not as an inheritance he'd accepted passively, but as a relationship he chose actively, repeatedly, in the ordinary and the difficult alike. His belief was not a costume he put on for comfort. It was the ground he stood on. And then came the audition. Dallas Jenkins, the creator of The Chosen, was not immediately certain. The role of Jesus of Nazareth is not a casting problem with obvious solutions. It is arguably the most freighted role in the history of human storytelling. A figure so layered, with theology and tradition, and 2,000 years of artistic interpretation that any actor who approaches it carries the accumulated weight of everything that came before. Jenkins needed someone who could hold that weight without being crushed by it, someone who could make it human without making it small. Roumie, by his own account, sat in a parking lot before walking into that audition and prayed, not for the role. He has been careful about that distinction. He prayed to be an instrument, to let whatever needed to come through him come through. Then he walked in. Those who were in the room that day describe a quality to his reading that they struggle to articulate without reaching for language that sounds, to secular ears, almost embarrassing. Something shifted. Something in the temperature of the room changed. Jenkins has said publicly that he left that audition not entirely sure what he had just witnessed, only that he had witnessed something. The role, in whatever way these things are decided, had found its person. What followed the casting was not uncomplicated. The hate mail came quickly, from people who believed with genuine conviction that no human being should attempt to portray Jesus Christ, that the very act was a transgression, an arrogance, a category error. Roumie received those letters and did not dismiss them. He understood the theology behind them, even where he disagreed. He carried the objections seriously, as a weight that kept him honest. Then the other letters came. A man who had not set foot in a church in 30 years watched the first season and went back the following Sunday. A woman caring for a dying husband wrote that the scene where Jesus wept was the first time she had cried since the diagnosis, and that it had broken something loose in her that needed to be broken. A teenager in a country where Christianity is a minority faith watched on a contraband phone and wrote that for the first time, the faith her grandmother had tried to give her felt like something she might actually want. Roumie read these letters, and he continued to visit hospitals, in character, sitting beside children whose bodies were failing them, children who looked at him with eyes that held no irony, who called him by the name of the one he portrayed. He never corrected them. He understood, with the quiet wisdom of a man shaped by 2 cultures and forged by a decade of waiting, that some moments are larger than accuracy, that what a suffering child needs is not a disclaimer. It is presence. This is who he was when he walked into that mall on an ordinary Tuesday. A man prepared by struggle to hold something sacred without dropping it. And so, when a 5-year-old boy in a crowded mall pointed at this man and said, "That's Jesus," Jonathan Roumie did not hesitate. What he did next is why the internet stopped. He was alone. No publicist. No assistant trailing behind with a schedule and a phone. No security detail running quiet interference between the famous face and the public that recognizes it. Just a man with a cart, moving through a mall the way anyone moves through a mall, with a list somewhere in his head, a particular purposelessness that errands produce, the mild and pleasant anonymity of being one body among hundreds. He was not performing. That is the detail that matters most, and it is the detail that everything else hinges on. Jonathan Roumie was not on set. He was not in character. He was not being filmed for content or followed for a documentary about his life post-Chosen. He was, by every available measure, simply a person running errands on a Tuesday, unremarkable to the strangers around him. Until he wasn't. The boy saw him from across the corridor. We know this because of how the moment unfolded, not in a flash of sudden recognition, but in that particular childhood stillness that precedes certainty. The stopping, the staring, the processing that happens before the words arrive. His mother felt it before she understood it, that interruption in her son's forward motion, the small hand going tight around her fingers, the quality of his silence shifting from ordinary to electric. She turned to look at what he was looking at. By then, he had already found his voice. The declaration carried. It found the gaps between the ambient noise, between the music piping, through the mall speakers, and the shuffle of foot traffic, and the distant laughter from the food court. And it arrived, clear and unambiguous, in the ears of strangers who had been thinking about nothing more significant than where to park and what to eat. Heads turned. Not all at once. The way attention spreads in a crowd. One person, then the person next to them, then the ripple outward. Eyes moving from the boy to the direction of his pointing finger, landing on the tall, dark-haired man who had, in the last 3 seconds, stopped walking. He had heard it. The mother was already in motion. That particular maternal emergency response that kicks in when a child has said something in public that requires immediate damage control. She was reaching for her son, cheeks burning, mouth forming the architecture of an apology. She would have gotten there. She would have pulled him close and said something gracious and self-deprecating to the man, something that gave him permission to smile politely and continue with his afternoon. That was the script the moment seemed to be following. Jonathan Roumie didn't follow it. He moved toward them, not with the brisk efficiency of someone managing an awkward situation, but with a slowness that was its own kind of statement. And then, without hesitation, without calculation, without any visible consideration of how this might look or what it might mean, for his afternoon, he folded himself downward, one knee on the mall floor. Eye level with the boy, the mother stopped reaching. What he said in those next moments exists in slightly different versions depending on who tells it. The specific words shifting the way details always shift when they pass through human memory and human retelling. But the essence holds across every account. He did not correct the boy. He did not reach for the comfortable adult exit of, "I'm actually just an actor, buddy," though no one would have blamed him for it, and most people would have. He looked at the child with complete, undivided presence, the kind that children feel in their bodies before they understand it in their minds. And he spoke to him gently. He honored what the boy had brought to the moment. He met the faith with grace rather than information. He blessed him, quietly, without theater. The mother was crying before she understood why. Around them, the mall had done something malls almost never do. It had slowed. People who had somewhere to be had stopped having somewhere to be. A woman near a storefront stood with her shopping bag held forgotten at her side. A teenager lowered his phone, then raised it again instinctively, because something in the human animal knows when it is watching something that should be remembered. The filming was not intrusive. It was involuntary. The reaching for a phone in that moment was not content creation. It was the oldest human impulse, the need to say, "This happened. I was here. This was real." Roumie stood. He spoke briefly with the mother, softly, privately, in the way that sacred things deserve to be completed. He placed his hand gently on the boy's head. Then he turned and walked on. No announcement. No pause for the camera. No post would appear on his account that evening, documenting the moment for his following. He simply continued with his afternoon, carrying it the way he carries everything, quietly, and without making it about himself. The person filming didn't know if they should post it. They almost didn't. But when they did, the world responded in a way no one could have predicted. It started small. Everything that matters does. A Facebook account with a few hundred followers, the kind of account that posts birthday wishes and local weather and the occasional shared recipe, uploaded a video at just past 7 in the evening. The caption was simple. No hashtags engineered for reach. No algorithm-optimized language designed to trigger engagement. Just a sentence or two about what the person had witnessed that afternoon, and a shaky, phone-filmed clip of a man on one knee in a shopping mall, speaking gently to a small boy while a mother stood beside them with her hand over her mouth. The first share came within minutes, then another. By 9 o'clock, the post had moved beyond the original poster's network entirely, that invisible threshold where content stops belonging to the person who made it and starts belonging to the internet at large. By midnight, it had been shared thousands of times. By the following morning, it had crossed platforms. Twitter picked it up the way Twitter picks up everything that carries genuine emotion, chaotically, passionately, and all at once. The clip appeared in feeds alongside breaking news and political arguments and sports scores, and it stopped thumbs in a way that breaking news and political arguments and sports scores had long since stopped doing. People watched it. Then they watched it again. Then they sent it to someone they loved without adding any words, because the clip had already said the thing they wanted to say and said it better. TikTok followed with its own particular grammar. Creators stitched the video with their reactions, faces filling the left half of the screen while the mall scene played on the right, and the reactions themselves became part of the content. A woman in her car, still in a parking lot, mascara tracking down her face, saying nothing for a full 10 seconds after the clip ended, before finally saying, "I don't even know why I'm crying." A father watching it with his teenage son, both of them going quiet, in a way that fathers and teenage sons almost never go quiet together. A pastor in Georgia who simply held up his phone to his congregation during Wednesday service and pressed play. The room, by every account, went still. Instagram moved in stacks, repost upon repost, each one accumulating its own galaxy of comments. Each comment section becoming its own small community of people who had found each other through a shared feeling they hadn't expected to feel that day. The numbers climbed past millions so quickly that the climbing itself became part of the story. And then the comments opened up. And the internet, which had spent years rehearsing its own cynicism, remembered something about itself. A veteran in Tennessee wrote that he had not cried since his deployment ended 11 years ago, and that he was not entirely sure what to do with what had just happened to him sitting at his kitchen table. A professor of philosophy at a university in the Northeast, a self-described atheist who included that detail as though it were relevant evidence, wrote simply, "I cried. I don't have a framework for why. I'm leaving that alone for now." A mother in Ohio described how her 8-year-old daughter, diagnosed 14 months earlier with a condition that had rearranged their entire lives, had watched The Chosen in her hospital bed during the worst weeks, and had asked to watch the scene where Jesus heals the sick child 4 times in a row. She wrote, "My daughter is still here. I don't know what that means. But I know what that show meant to her when nothing else reached her. And I know what this man is." A priest in Ireland shared it during a homily. A pastor in Lagos showed it to his congregation on a projector screen. A grandmother in the Philippines, 73 years old, with a phone her grandchildren had taught her to use for exactly this kind of thing, forwarded the video to every member of her family across 4 countries, with a caption that translated roughly to, "Watch this and tell me God is not real." The public figures came next, and they came carefully. Celebrities from faith communities shared it openly, with language that was personal rather than promotional. Politicians, and this alone was remarkable enough to be its own story, reposted it without commentary, without making it an opportunity, without attaching their names to it in any way that felt like extraction. The silence of the caption was its own eloquence. Even people who disagreed about everything else seemed to agree, without saying so, that this particular moment belonged to everyone and to no one. The media personalities who had been dismissive of The Chosen went quiet. A few went further. One writer who had authored a piece 18 months earlier characterizing the show as faith-based wish fulfillment for a politically motivated audience posted the clip without comment and then, when asked about the apparent contradiction, said only, "Sometimes you're wrong." "This is one of those times," Dallas Jenkins responded publicly, and his response was so characteristically, almost stubbornly humble, that it became its own small viral moment within the larger one. He did not celebrate the numbers. He did not position the moment as a win for the show or a validation of the project. He pointed away from Roumie, away from The Chosen, toward the faith itself, saying, in essence, that if this moment moved you, don't credit the actor or the production. Credit the one the actor was trying to reflect. The deflection was so complete and so genuine that even people with no religious framework found it quietly disarming. And Jonathan Roumie? He posted once. A few sentences about the boy. How small he was. How certain, how the clarity of a child's faith is something an adult spends a lifetime trying to recover. He asked people to pray for the family. He thanked no one for the attention. He did not mention the view count or the shares, or the comment sections filling up with the accumulated grief and wonder and longing of millions of strangers. He seemed, in the most genuine possible way, bewildered by the fuss. Like a man who had simply knelt on a mall floor because kneeling was the only appropriate response, and could not quite understand why that required explanation. The internet, for one rare and luminous news cycle, did something right. But the story didn't end with the retweets. Because a few days later, something happened that made even the most hardened skeptics go completely quiet. The video had gone quiet in the way viral things go quiet, not forgotten but absorbed. folded into the collective memory of an internet that moves fast and holds on to very little. Most moments like this one have a lifespan of 72 hours. They crest, they trend, they become yesterday's warmth in a feed that is always chasing tomorrow's outrage. The world was already moving on, and then the mother spoke. She didn't go to a major outlet. She didn't hire anyone to manage the narrative or negotiate the terms of her story. She sat down for a local interview, the kind with modest lighting and a camera that costs a fraction of what the network affiliates use. And she talked, quietly, without performance, the way people talk when they are not trying to be believed but simply cannot help telling the truth. Her son had been going through a hard season. She chose those words carefully and didn't elaborate beyond them, because some details belonged to a family and not to the internet, and she was wise enough to know the difference. What she would say was this: for months before that Tuesday afternoon, something had been dimmed in him, the particular light that lives in small children, that irreducible, ungovernable joy that makes them run instead of walk and laugh instead of smile, had been quieter than it should have been. She had been carrying that observation the way mothers carry things, which is to say silently and with great weight, and in the spaces between all the other things that needed doing. She had not told him where they were going that afternoon. It was errands. Ordinary errands. Nothing she had planned or prepared or prayed over in any specific way. And then, in the middle of a mall, her son had seen a man across a corridor and gone still with certainty. And the man had knelt and spoken, and placed his hand gently on her son's head. And something. She paused here in the interview, and the pause was long enough that the interviewer didn't fill it, which was the right instinct. Something had shifted. She saw it happen in real time, a light returning, not dramatically, not with the sudden shock of a switch being thrown, but the way dawn arrives, gradually, then undeniably. She said he had slept through the night for the first time in weeks. She was not asking for sympathy. She was precise about that. She did not frame it as a miracle or make claims she couldn't support. She simply described what she had witnessed as a mother in the specific and unglamorous language of someone who knows her child better than anyone on earth. Something had been given back to her son in that corridor. She didn't know what to call it. She called it peace. The interview spread with a different velocity than the original video. Quieter, deeper. Shared not with exclamation, but with the particular solemnity of people passing along something they want others to hold carefully. Meanwhile, the numbers were moving in ways that defied the typical arc of a viral moment. The Chosen's viewership didn't just spike. It spread geographically in patterns that surprised even the show's own analytics team. Downloads surged in Indonesia, in Japan, in Brazil, where the show had existed at the margins of cultural conversation, and suddenly found itself at the center of one. Countries with no Christian majority, no particular cultural infrastructure for this kind of content, were queuing episodes in volumes that the platform hadn't anticipated. Something in the mall clip had functioned as a door, and people who had never considered walking through it were walking through it now, churches, and this was reported anecdotally, in the scattered and unscientific way that true things often are. Reported something the following Sunday. Faces that hadn't been there the week before. People who had watched a video on their phone, and then, for reasons they couldn't fully articulate, found themselves wanting to sit somewhere quiet with other people and feel whatever they had felt again, but in person and together. Then came the mosaic. Once the mother's interview circulated, something loosened in people who had their own Jonathan Roumie stories and hadn't known there was a place to put them. They emerged from comment sections and community threads and private messages forwarded until they became public. Accounts of hospital visits, of quiet moments in corridors outside pediatric wards, of a man who had sat beside a child, who called him by a name that wasn't his and had not corrected them, had simply stayed and prayed, and been present in the way that presence is sometimes the only medicine that works. Each story was its own small tile. Together, they made a portrait of a man who had not kept his role at the studio, who had carried it out into the world and lived inside it, not as performance but as practice. And then, weeks after the original video had settled into the permanent record of things the internet had witnessed and kept, a second clip appeared, shorter than the first, shot on a couch in the soft light of a family living room, with the particular warmth that home videos have always had and always will. The boy was watching The Chosen with his family. On the screen, Jonathan Roumie moved through a scene with the unhurried grace that had made millions weep. The boy watched. Then he turned to his mother. His face carried the expression of someone whose understanding of the world has just been confirmed in the most satisfying possible way. He pointed at the screen. "See, Mommy," he said. "I told you." She laughed and cried, at the same time, in the way that only the most true things make you do. And in that moment, something that had started as a child's simple mistake became something much harder to dismiss. It became a question every one of us has to answer for ourselves. Let's sit with the question that has been underneath this entire story from the beginning. The one that the viral spread and the comment sections and the mother's interview and the follow-up clip have all been circling without quite landing on directly. A child looked at a man and saw Jesus. The adults around him saw an actor. Who is seeing more clearly? It is easy to answer that question quickly, and the quick answer is satisfying in the way that easy answers always are. The boy was confused. He watches a show. He recognized a face. The end. File it under cute and keep scrolling. But that answer has a problem, and the problem is everything that happened afterward. Confused children do not move veterans to tears. Mistaken identities do not send viewership surging across continents. A simple case of a kid recognizing a celebrity does not make a grandmother in the Philippines forward a video to every member of her family across 4 countries because she needs them to see it before another day passes. Something else was happening, something the quick answer cannot contain. Children perceive before they interpret. That is not a weakness. It is the last form of clarity most of us ever have access to, and we spend the rest of our lives slowly losing it. The 5-year-old in that mall had not yet acquired the sophisticated adult machinery that processes experience through layers of irony and self-protection, and the exhausting management of how things appear. He felt something when he looked at that man, something that his entire being recognized before his vocabulary could catch up, and the only word he had for what he felt was the truest word available to him. We call that confusion. He called it recognition. Jonathan Roumie has said, in interviews that reward the listening, that he does not approach the role of Jesus as a performance to deliver to an audience. He approaches it as a practice, a form of discipleship. He is not trying to show people who Jesus was. He is trying to become, incrementally and imperfectly, and with full awareness of the distance between himself and the one he portrays, more like him. The camera is almost incidental to that project. The show is almost incidental. What is not incidental is the daily, unglamorous, private work of trying to close the gap between what he represents and what he actually is. This is why the mall moment was not a performance. You cannot perform what Roumie did in that corridor. Not with that quality, not with that instinct, not with that complete absence of self-consciousness, unless it has already become who you are in the moments when no one is watching. Grace practiced in private becomes reflex in public. Humility rehearsed in the ordinary becomes instinct in the extraordinary. He knelt because kneeling was, by that point, simply what his body knew to do when a child needed to be met at eye level. He had been preparing for that moment his entire life. He just didn't know the address. Widen the frame now. Because this story is not ultimately about religion, and it would be a smaller thing if it were. It is about what happens to a human being who commits fully, not partially, not conveniently, not in the ways that cost nothing, to something larger than themselves. It is about the particular kind of person that kind of commitment produces. Someone who moves differently through the world, who slows when others rush, who kneels when others nod, who meets a child's faith with presence rather than correction. We are living through a moment that is desperately short of such people. Not because they don't exist. They do, in every community, in every tradition, in every corner of human life. where someone has quietly decided to be more than the culture asks them to be. But because the culture has become very good at making visibility feel like the point, at rewarding the performance of virtue more reliably than virtue itself, at producing people who know exactly how goodness should look on camera, but have never quite gotten around to practicing it off. Jonathan Roumie went viral not because he played Jesus well on television. He went viral because when the cameras were off and the script was gone and the moment arrived unannounced in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, he was already the person the role required. He had done the work. He had closed enough of the gap that a 5-year-old, with the unfiltered perception of the very young, looked at him across a crowded mall and felt something ancient and true. The world is starving for people who kneel, who make themselves small so that others feel seen, who carry their calling not as a brand to be managed, but as a commitment to be honored daily in the moments that no one will ever film and the internet will never find. The little boy pointed, and in doing so, he asked every one of us the same question. Not who is that man, but who are we becoming? A little boy in a mall pointed at a stranger and said, "That's Jesus." And the stranger knelt down. That's the whole story. And that's everything. These are the moments that don't make the headlines, the ones that happen in the margins of ordinary days, witnessed by a handful of people and a shaky phone camera and one mother who will carry it for the rest of her life. These are the moments that remind us what we actually are, underneath the noise and the exhaustion and the endless, grinding performance of modern life, quietly human, quietly hungry for something real. Have you ever had a moment like that? A simple act of grace from a stranger that stopped you completely, that made the rest of the day feel different, lighter, like something had been returned to you that you hadn't known was missing? Drop it in the comments. This community exists for exactly those stories. We read them. We need them. And so does everyone else scrolling past. If this video moved you, share it. Because someone in your life needs to see it today. You already know who. Subscribe not because we ask, but because you believe, as we do, that these stories deserve to be told and found and kept. And if you haven't watched The Chosen yet, now you know the man behind the role. Maybe that little boy knew exactly what he was looking at. Maybe we all do, when we're paying attention.